Hi, everyone, and welcome to our evening and our morning for some of you with Dr. Jason Hawrelak. So I'm going to give him an introduction. It can't be short because there's a lot to say for what he's done, and then we can go ahead and get started. And so we can see questions too. If you all have questions that come up during the interview, go ahead and put them in the comments box, and we can see those come in here. And so I'll just start gathering those, and we can get to those also as it's appropriate. Okay, so Dr. Hawrelak actually started studying gastrointestinal health, the GIT, the gastrointestinal tract microbiota, and probiotics during his final year of his undergraduate training. And so then he went on to study his honors and his PhD degrees in the areas of the gastrointestinal microbiota, irritable bowel syndrome, and the clinical applications of pre and probiotics. He has written extensively in the medical literature on these topics, including 16 textbook chapters, and his research has been cited over 800 times. He's a clinician, so he's actively working in this field with more than 18 years experience in busy natural medicine apothecaries and clinics. The main focus of his practice is in the treatment of gastrointestinal conditions, both acute and chronic. He also is teaching, so that's how I've gotten to know him. So he teaches health professionals, undergraduate and postgraduate levels, and he currently coordinates and teaches at the College of Health and Medicine at the University of Tasmania and at the University of Western States in Portland, Oregon. He is also a visiting research fellow at the Australian Research Centre for Complementary and Integrative Medicine and at the University of Technology in Sydney. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. And to see you in person after, seeing you virtually previously.
Absolutely. I know. Hearing voices is a little bit different than seeing someone in person. So it's like, I feel like, oh, we're like the Jetsons. I often think that to myself with the technology. So nice that we have that opportunity.
It was pretty cool because I'm like down at the bottom of the earth, far away from anywhere, essentially. And there's pros to that, and we've got the cleanest air on Earth and the cleanest rain on Earth, but we're also very, very far from anywhere where anything's happening. So it's really nice to be able to connect in this way.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that because we often joke here in Boston that our state bird is the car because that's what does the most honking. So we don't have that.
No, well, Tasmania, the state that I'm in, is the southern tip of Australia, and it's 1/3 of the state's national park, and it's only got 600,000 people, I think, in the entire state. So it's pretty low population density, and a lot. I could just drive in 20 minutes and be up in the forest and not see a soul. And you could drive a little bit more, and you could walk for days and not see anybody at all. So we're pretty lucky in that respect.
Yeah, that's pulling at my heartstrings. So, Dr. Hawrelak, can you just start with telling us kind of just your general overview of the function and importance of the microbiota? I know we focus on the gut, but it's systemic, so.
Yeah, and we do, as scientists, we've always divided things up because we like dividing things up to, the oral microbiome, nasal microbiome, breast milk microbiome, vagina microbiome, gut microbiome, skin microbiome. So the difference, but obviously we're continuous too, so there's these areas that sort of flow into each other. Certainly when I started out, and this is essentially back in 2000 when I started my honors research, people only talked about the gut microflora and very little was talked about other microbiomes in the system. The term microbiome wasn't even used. We had called everything microflora at that point in time, and that sort of evolved onwards. And it's been an interesting journey to watch that growth in research that has really given us a different perspective on the microflora, microbiota in the gut, because at that time we knew that it was important for optimal immune system function and gut motility and sort of digestive function. Those were the things that we talked about the gut microflora. And most clinicians weren't in the broader field of medicine weren't particularly concerned about treatments that cause damage to the gut bacteria. And there were some researchers at that time going, hey, this is this is actually important. These cells play important roles. We should be paying attention to this. And there's some researchers start calling it the microbiota organ at that time point, because they just started linking in other capacities that the microbiota actually had in the role that it played in the human body. And now we know it's, that expansion of research. We know that it's important for metabolic health. We know it's important for brain functioning and mood. Certainly, we've reiterated and refocused on the research showing how important it is for immune system function and digestive function, but even the transformation of things like polyphenols, like we're all eating blueberries and pomegranates and raspberries and black currants, etc., getting these anti-cancer compounds. And we are, but if we don't actually have if the microbiota didn't convert them through to other compounds, we would never absorb them, and they pass straight through, because 95% of ingested polyphenols are essentially unabsorbable to us unless they're worked on by the microbiota. So those cells play a very pivotal role. And even as a medicinal herbalist, most of my herbs actually rely on microbiota transformations to actually create the active compounds. Not all, but a lot of them do. So if things that damage that ecosystem could actually have a lot of flow-on effects that we never considered before, which is the efficacy of medicinal herbs, and God, that other looking at things like chemotherapy and pharmaceuticals that are activated by these same microbes, which could allow for differences in how people respond based on what bacteria are present in their gut and what species are not present anymore due to sort of the dwindling microbiome situation that we find ourselves in as a species.
Mm-hmm. It was actually one of my favorite things to learn in your class about the polyphenols. And I've told so many people, I hope it's accurate to say this, that, your gut microbes eat color in the form of polyphenol, because it's just lovely to think about that. And yeah, the information, I know that there are quite a few, people who are practicing herbalism, and over the years, I've been with practitioners that are herbalists, and I don't think that I don't know if anybody, I've never heard this anywhere, make the connection that we need the microbes to break down glycosides, right? Is that the active kind of?
Yeah, for many herbs, we rely on polyphenols, and it's such a broad class of compounds, but even things like Panax ginseng, the compounds of Panax ginseng, those are ginsenosides that we find in the root, you do not find in your bloodstream after oral ingestion. What you find is the microbial transformation products. So they convert those ginsenosides to something else, we absorb them, and then we get the benefits from it. So, and that's not a rare scenario. Most herbs are like that. And it certainly brings a lot of questions, considerations and thoughts around this idea of what I mentioned before, the dwindling microbiome and differences between the microbial signature between different patients actually will mean that they respond differently to herbs. And as I said before, as research bubbles keeps building along, we'll probably find so much pharmaceuticals too, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. And so could you talk a little bit about, I'm already off the thread with my interview because now I'm getting curious about what you're saying, but would you talk a little bit about the disappearing microbiota hypothesis? Yeah,
so it was put forth, I think, formally by Martin Blaser and colleagues who I think is the New York Uni in the States. Fantastic researcher. I love where he's coming from thought-wise. But the essential hypothesis here is that the Western lifestyle, which includes obviously very big changes in diet from previous generations, but also use of pharmaceuticals, C-section births, formula feeding, use of antibacterial everything, as well as other exposure to environmental chemicals, and a lot of antibiotic usage has essentially meant that we used to have a very wide, diverse ecosystem, and that with every generation of Westerner, we get less and less species present, because we're in a situation where we pass on the microbiota from one generation to the other, from mum to pup primarily, and anything that we do to the mum's microbiota, so if she used to have this, but then after a number of antibiotics and etc., that she can only pass on what she has. This is the interesting thing. And we've essentially lost a decent diversity of our ecosystem already as Westerners. As any generation passes, we lose more and more because we're taking a lot of antibiotics, and because the aforementioned factors too all play a role in diversity. And even things like proton pump inhibitors, which are a huge class of medications. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs also have antibacterial compounds. So when people are taking them daily, if you take a one-off for menstrual pain, it's not a concern. But you take this daily for months to years because you've got arthritic pain, it becomes a problem. And you start losing the diversity to those things. And we don't even know the consequences of this in reality. You know, we know that we're getting allergic disease is risen off the charts, autoimmune diseases are rising off the charts, and other, you know, chronic, I'm trying to think of the right word, but chronic killers like cancer are also obviously going up. And many people are tying this, researchers are tying this to loss of microbial diversity, and even things like, you know, we know now that the research is pretty clear that early exposure to antibiotics, even in, you know, infancy and early childhood, means you have an increased risk of being obese later in life and developing type 2 diabetes, because we're actually altering that ecosystem at pretty critical points, which has flow-on consequences for everything, because this ecosystem is tied in with every system in your body. So it's not surprising that if we're actually significantly altering the cell types that are there in the amounts, that there are flow-on consequences when we think about it and our current understanding. And it is in some respects scary, because, you know, when you're down to there, it's not so simple to increase your diversity back up to the level that humans were a couple generations ago.
Yeah, somebody just asked, and I mean, this is a natural question, like, how do you read Diversify? Which is one of the most, I think, like, poignant teaching points that you make. So what do we do?
I've got a whole lecture about diversifying the microbiome. And there's a certain ways we can do it to encourage the survivors of the sort of Western lifestyle onslaught that are there in small amounts. And those things can be from eating essentially more fiber, more polyphenols, more plant foods, because essentially those things have got compounds that reach the colon to nourish microbes. And we have this idea that, you know, fiber is fiber, and it's not. Fiber comes in all different shapes and sizes and configurations, and all those different shapes and sizes feed different sort of species preferentially. And some are, you know, species we've got are pretty broad and, you know, it's anything, others are more selective. So we know essentially the broader your diet is in terms of whole plant foods, the greater diversity your ecosystem generally has. And that's a way of feeding up the survivors that are there. Certainly prebiotics play a role in this scenario too. And we'll probably discuss more prebiotics later on in terms of what I mean by that specifically, because I think the term is widely misused. And obviously avoidance of factors, and you can't necessarily go back and change if you're given antibiotics when you were 1, and now you're 30, you can't go back and change that, obviously, but if there's any surviving bugs that are there below technical thresholds, by doing some of those processes that I mentioned before, and even exercising moderately seems to increase levels of diversity, but it's just bringing up species that are already there in low amounts. So it's a different situation in terms of, and that's going to have a finite way of improving diversity, because if you were there, you can get to there, but if the species aren't there, they're extinct, their ecosystem is a much more challenging scenario. And really the only way we know of that does this from research perspectives is with the fecal microbial transplant, or FMT. In theory, breast milk should be able to do it too, because breast milk also contains, you know, 100, 150 plus different species of bacteria. And certainly for, you know, infants and toddlers who take a course of antibiotics and while still being breastfed, we can be pretty assured that they're going to be reseeded with any species that were lost from that process. But there hasn't been much research in the way of, you know, re-inoculating human guts with breast milk yet, but I think we'll get there. I mean, even the stuff with FMT is relatively new, and I think that's where, and I think there's a few ways where things will go in the future. I think in the future they're going to have fecal banking, where before you give a child a course of antibiotics, that might be because they've got a life-threatening infection, and they'll essentially take some fecal specimen out, give them the antibiotics, and then when the antibiotics are done, they'll put the poop back in, and that will essentially reseed them perfectly in the right balance of microbes to what they were before. So I think this will be commonplace in the future, but that still might be 10, 15 years away before the knowledge of the importance of the microbiome reaches the point that people think of it as a bigger issue, and it's getting there. I mean, it's for someone who's been researching this area for 18 years, it's pretty phenomenal to see the shifts that have occurred over the 18 years, and awareness of the microbiome, that, you know, people were talking about collateral damage from antibiotics. You know, microbiome researchers were, but the broader medical community was not aware of this at all. And from probably 2012 onwards, it sort of has popped up onto the radar in mainstream high-end medical journals that being aware of collateral damage from antibiotic usage is important. It hasn't actually filtered out to clinical practice, sadly, I can say. But we still have overuse of antibiotics for viral infections, for example. Which was condition can be possibly be helpful for, but they're still prescribed often. A study in Australia last year showing 85% of people who go to their medical practitioner for viral bronchitis get prescribed antibiotics. So the issue is still ongoing, but the awareness is slowly growing.
I think people might be surprised, like in the solutions for like how do we re-diversify, you didn't say probiotics, because I think there is this this conception that we can re-diversify with probiotics. I mean, I know I was surprised to learn in your class that maybe not. So could you just speak to that for a moment?
Yeah, and I think this idea that we can recolonize our gut with bacteria from fermented foods or from probiotic supplements, especially way back to Metchnikoff, who's the originator of yogurt, back in the probably early 1900s. And he had this idea that, I think a bit of a wandering journey to answer that question, but he had this idea that people live to be very healthy to well into the old age in this part of Eastern Europe. We call it a blue zone now. And he thought he attributed the long life of these Bulgarian peasants to their drinking of a fermented milk product. And we now call that yogurt, but then it was just fermented milk for that part of Europe. And then he was like, okay, what's in it? And he isolated out two bacterial species, Lactobacillus delbrueckii, isospecies bulgaricus, and Streptococcus thermophilus. And those are the same two species that in yogurt all over the world is because we're adding those two species into milk. But his idea there was if we ingested this yogurt, these bacteria would colonize permanently and prevent the putrefaction of protein. And his theory at that point was that the putrefaction of protein by gut microbes caused disease and premature aging. And if they could arrest that, we would slow the aging process and the disease process. But that idea of permanent recolonization, I think, stems back from that. But up until probably the 1980s, 90s onwards, we had no real way of knowing when we gave up eat yogurt or took a probiotic supplement, of which there probably weren't that many around back in those days, whether these microbes would actually stick around permanently or not. But research from the 80s, 90s, 2000s onwards has clearly shown that you might find one where the bacteria hung around in 30% of people for 6 months. But the vast majority of people, they are gone within a week or two. And we've got a lot of clinical trials showing this clearly now. So we don't get that reseeding permanently effect from that, or from what we find in sauerkraut or kimchi or kombucha or kefir. And even if you look at the species composition of those fermented foods, and I'm a fan of fermented foods, but they're not doing what I think they're often promoted doing for directly reseeding, because they don't contain Anorostipes or Staphylogranular or Roseburia or Blottia or these other species that actually are normal members of your gut. They might well contain some lactobacilli, but lactobacilli in your gut only make up about 0.01 to 0.1% of the gut ecosystem. So even if you could reintroduce those ones, they're still just such a small proportion of the whole ecosystem that might be 100 genera strong, and you're only introducing species or one genera back in from a fermented food of a type that has a capacity of surviving the gut for any length of time. Now, it doesn't mean that having kefir or sauerkraut will necessarily help the ecosystem reset itself a wee bit better after antibiotics. I'm sure it does, but not via that mechanism of reseeding, and the bugs come there, then they grow and repopulate your gut with lactobacilli. But they can, through their production of short chain fatty acids like acetate and lactate, change the pH to help induce regrowth of species that have been essentially bashed about by the antibiotics. So they still have a role to play, but it's just different than what people are ascribing to it.
I think for most people, that's that's a total revolution in clinical practice, because I think a lot of us as practitioners, I mean, I know I was using probiotics because they would like help recolonize the gut, you know, after people had taken antibiotics or, you know, been ill or like that. And so it's like just that point alone. And now I want to ask, you know, like, okay, well then, okay, so how do we use, you know, fibrous foods and prebiotics and like that to, like you're saying, feed the survivors, which is, it seems like clinically where we kind of should be putting our focus. But just to know, like, okay, when we're using probiotics, it's not kind of what we have probably thought. We were doing something else.
Yeah, very much so. And I call this the shift in probiotic prescribing paradigms, because we have research showing it doesn't do that. It's not like probiotics have a whole wide range. I mean, you've studied with me, you know, I love probiotics. I use them on every patient, but they're not doing that. They're not what you call it out in UC. Different strains have different actions. Like there's some strains that are helpful for endometriosis, and some that are helpful for treatment of mastitis or prevention of mastitis. Other strains that are helpful for ulcerative colitis. Other strains can decrease cholesterol levels or decrease blood pressure, and it's not because they're recolonized or reseeding. It's because they actually produce metabolites that have therapeutic effects, or they interact with your gut cells or your immune cells to actually induce physiological change. That's what they're doing, and we have to really make that shift. Just like I'm prescribing chamomile as a medicinal herb, not because I'm hoping chamomile is going to grow in your gut and then start flowering, because it has medicinal attributes like antispasmodic properties or calming sedative properties. That's why I'm choosing it. And I can choose a probiotic strain because it has the properties I want to use as a treatment. And this is the shift that research has really been shown. It's what reality occurs over the last 30 years. It's just been slow getting out there to clinicians. And even those of us who see, I'd say that functional medicine and natural medicine practitioners are always generally at the forefront of thinking, but it's been hard for this idea to even move through this community, because I think we're very attached to this idea that we do a stool test, it's with lactulose. They take lactulose, reseed, all good. But this is not what happens. And if that's all we're using probiotics for, we're like missing out the vast majority of things that they're useful for. There's a whole range of microbes that are being referred to as now as psychobiotics, because they have the capacity to produce things like serotonin or produce things like GABA. And there's actually researchers working on these isolating strains that have these characteristics right now. Others that can interact with specific gut cells to increase serotonin production in the gut. So we're not taking that because it reseeds, but because it actually will improve serotonin levels, and improves our mood, etc.
And that kind of leads, I want to get to how we really specifically can refeed what's there, but you're talking about probiotic strain, and I think that that's a really important point that you teach to, which is there needs to be a very specific knowing of what the probiotic is that we're using as practitioners. And so strain specificity is also something that I was not aware of, that I learned from you. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so that concept that there are differences within microbes within the same species was probably new to me back in 2000 when I started delving into this field too, because I wasn't taught that in my naturopathic training. But the research was around at that time showing that was already the case, and that was I've been teaching this strain specificity or pushing this movement over for 18 years, teaching practitioners about it, because it's actually really important with how you use probiotic supplements. And I think the best analogy here that really connects and stays in your mind is looking at dogs. So we have all dogs are the same species, Canis familiaris, but you can have an Irish Wolfhound on one side and a Chihuahua on the other. Now, they're the same species, but they actually act and look and are quite different at the same time. But same species. That's the key thing. And now, strains of bacteria within a given species don't differ in terms of hair length or size in the same way that we do get with dogs, but they do differ in almost every other attribute potentially. With a few genes turned on or off here and there can mean that they can survive stomach acid or not, survive exposure to bile or not, adhere to your gut. And how they adhere can differ in terms of strains within species, how they interact with your immune system, and if they interact, whether they produce an antimicrobial compound that might help kill off potential pathogens in the gut. Those are strain-specific qualities, whether they can break down histamine, whether they can slow down gut transit time or speed up gut transit time. Those things are all strain-specific qualities. You can't get that by just looking at the species name. You have to look at the strain and the research that's done on that specific genetically unique strain. And I think in some ways we're familiar with this with the concept of E. coli. E. coli, single species, we get Montezuma's revenge because we get a diarrhea-causing type strain of E. coli. We can get the E0157 strain of E. coli that causes bloody diarrhea and death due to kidney failure. And then we have the E. coli Nissl in 1917 that is used as a probiotic in sort of Europe since the 1920s, that has a beneficial gut healing effect. And these are all the same species. They're just different strains within that species with different genes turned off or on that determine whether it's a pathogen or beneficial, or sort of not like most E. coli, I got much more just in the middle or benign. But we sort of haven't put that same sort of thinking in the world of probiotics now with the genera like lactobacilli and bifidobacteria, which make up the two genera that make up the bulk of probiotic supplements in the market. We don't have to worry about the harm aspect so much, thankfully, but we do have to worry about what genes are turned on or off, which means they're going to be therapeutic or not. And I can assure you there's a lot of strains in there that actually do not survive gastric acid or bile salts, which are pretty key pivotal attributes of whether it's going to have an effect in the small bowel or colon, if that's what you're wanting to treat. If it dies in the stomach or small intestine, it's not going to have a way of interacting with your immune system or producing antimicrobial compounds which inhibit the growth of potential pathogens, etc. They need to be alive to have those sort of attributes.
So I think I would be remiss not to mention, so your website is ProbioticAdvisor.com. And, I had access to it in school to look up the different strains and then their researched use so that we can support the body. And so, it came with enrollment at UWS. And then as I was, researching for this, I was like, it's $49.95 a year to have access to that. Yeah. I mean, that's like a clinical game changer to have access to all of that in one place. I mean, the website alone has great information that, I'm like recommending it to people, whether they, get the strain information or not. But, you can just go in, type in, like, let's say you're seeing a client that is dealing with intestinal permeability, and you type in intestinal permeability, and then up pops Floristore in the United States, is what we have. That's incredible. It's an incredible service. So I just want to plug a little bit that's out there, and it's happening, and there's great information there.
Thank you. It's been an interesting evolution of that resource from when I first started teaching about probiotic strain specificity and the research that was there in 2001. I think I was teaching at Naturopathic University at that point. I had like a few paper documents that would have all that same information, and it expanded from like 10 pages to 15 to 20 to 30 to 40, and it also became 3 documents you had to use in concert. And I was very happy to be able to dump all that from partly my brain and also the physical documents into a database, because the amount of research that's been done. I mean, there's 200 probiotic studies published a year back in maybe 2000 or something versus now. And then our probiotic products in the market were very little back in 2000 compared to now. So as a clinician, it's like the bits I like with the database, you can search by product. You can go, okay, what's in this particular product that your patient just brought in to the clinic? I haven't heard it before. Let's look at it. What strains are in it? What research has been done? So it's just a nice way of combining all that stuff together. And it's just because of the research has bubbled up so much, it's just no longer could fit into a paper document. It had to be something else, more user-friendly and larger.
Yeah, it's an excellent clinical tool. And it's also now why I order Nancy's organic yogurt in bulk.
Yes. I can understand why, because that's one of the few medicinal yogurts in the U.S. market versus food yogurts.
So, okay, so if we've established that we're using strain-specific probiotics for specific issues to support our clients, which is in NTPs and NTCs. We have clients, so we support, them. Okay. And so I'm using our lingo. But then, can you talk a little bit about diet and prebiotics and like that to feed what we have there permanently to, like you're saying, feed the survivors?
Yeah, so after chemotherapy or radiotherapy or antibiotic use, like if you just had a very altered ecosystem, some species will have tolerated that treatment. Okay, they would have had the right genes turned on to resist whatever that insult was, and others will not have. And sadly, some species may not be recoverable because they've gone extinct to that process. And this is primarily an issue when people do antibiotic cocktails. So if they end up doing 2 or 3 antibiotics at the same time, or an antibiotic for a longer period of time than just 5 or 7 or 10 days or something, there's a greater chance of actual extinction events, as I would call it, for certain species. So once they're extinct, we can't necessarily help them. But if you've got the survivors whose population's been brought down, then what we really need to do is focus on nourishing and nurturing those species back up to the point where they become detectable again. And one of the main tools, we essentially use dietary approaches, and I hinted at this before, but it is really color, polyphenols, and it is fiber. Those are the core aspects. But I think the other tool that I think is fundamental in this is prebiotics. And as I mentioned before, this term is bandied about widely as something that feeds bacteria. No, it's something it's a substance that is selectively fermented by one or a limited number of beneficial bacteria in the gut that produces a rise of that particular species almost in isolation, and that has a health benefit. That's the definition. And that's quite different than something that feeds bacteria. If all fibers will end up feeding bacteria, not even almost any substance will feed some bacteria in your gut. So it's like not a useful thing. And taking an artificial sweetener will feed some bacteria in your gut. Do you want that? No. It's actually feeding bugs you don't want well fed. So it's the specific definition is what counts. And there's only some substances that meet that definition. And those ones we know. So if someone has taken a course of antibiotics and their bifidobacteria, one of those key genera in the gut that is plays pretty pivotal roles in your health and keeping you healthy, keeping your with good gut integrity, and potentially producing things like GABA to keep your brain in the right zone and help keep stress hormones down. Bifidobacteria in your gut may well be playing a role in a number of those pretty pivotal physiological systems in your body. And if you're all of a sudden that species goes from being 2 or 3% of the ecosystem, which would be probably pretty normal for bifidobacteria, down to 0.00001, you're not going to get the benefits of bifidobacteria anymore at that low population. But if we're able to provide a selective fertilizer that only bifidobacteria or very few other species can eat, then we can bring that population back up relatively quickly. And this is what I love. And you can verify this with good stool testing pre and post very clearly of going, okay, this person apparently has no bifidobacteria. I give them a prebiotic substance like inulin type fructans or fruit oligosaccharides or galactoligosaccharides or lactulose to be the 3 probably best known and best researched prebiotics. And we're essentially selectively feeding bifidobacteria and maybe a couple of its friends, as I would call it, like Akkermansia, Faecalibacterium. So they're very selective, and their populations will go up as a consequence of that. And you can see it clearly. It's lovely to actually see these ecosystems that can come back. Would the bifidobacteria come back without prebiotics? My experience is that sometimes very, very slowly over time, and it would depend a bit on dietary factors, because you can eat inulin in Jerusalem artichokes and asparagus and chicory roots and dandelion roots and burdock and yacon tubers, onions, garlic. There's certainly ways of feeding that same species up with food choices, and galactoligosaccharides are also found in beets and legumes and a little bit of small amount of LSA and a few other things. So there are food sources for some of these things too, but I often will use supplements because the effect, the dosage that you can achieve is higher and it's more consistent. I mean, if you can eat half a tuber of Jerusalem artichoke every day for 6 months, that'll do it too. But they're only in season in my experience for short windows, at least in this part of the world. And yeah, you can eat them for a month where you can get them fresh, but then it's going to stop at that point. So the powdered supplements often come in very handy as a way of doing it consistently. But I'm still a fan of using prebiotic-rich foods as well, for that matter, my patients. But we may rely on the supplements initially to bring the population back up from the edge of extinction, and once it's back up to a healthy range, then we'll rely on dietary means to keep that population well fed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I can definitely say after taking your class, I was eating much more like red lentils, black rice, green lentils, sweet potatoes, cocoa powder. I mean, that's getting maybe more into colonic foods too. So I don't know if we need to differentiate that, but
well, so colonic foods are foods that essentially survive the digestive process and reach the colon to feed microbes. So dietary fibers, pectins, gums, mucilages would all fit that category. So any sort of whole plant food is going to contain those sorts of compounds in different amounts and different ratios, which is why the diversity of the diet is key, because that means you feed a diversity of microbes, because there might be one or two species that are very selective and only one fiber shaped like this. But if it's fiber comes a different shape, it's not going to feed that species, but it'll feed something else. So if you have a diversity of foodstuffs, whole plant foodstuffs, you feed a diversity of microbes, and essentially you could argue that all whole plant foods contain some colonic foods, but there'll be some that can hit higher amounts as well. And in these days, I tend to divide up a little bit into prebiotic-like foods, which are foods that we have human clinical trials showing that we can increase levels of beneficial bacteria when consumed, versus those that colonic food won't necessarily selectively feed for one or feed a whole wide range of microbes. And that's a good thing, and we want to be consuming those foods daily as well. But as I said, in certain circumstances where the bifidobacteria or Akkermansia or Fecalibacterium or butyrate-producing microbes have been really damaged in someone's ecosystem, we really want to selectively feed them to and nurture those populations up, as well as feeding the broader microbe community.
Mm-hmm. Actually, so I'm going to ask a question from the people that are watching. Yeah. So one person asked the use of probiotics. Should prebiotics be taken while there is active candida, and can targeted probiotics or prebiotics help with candida?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, there's some research that goes back to 1997. So I came across that when I was writing my first thesis, and it was looking at lactulose for the treatment of candidiasis. So I've used lactulose to treat my patients with candida since probably 2000, 2001, with great results. So even though it tastes like sugar, it smells like sugar, it's got a selective shape to it that not all microbes can eat. That's the thing that makes prebiotics unique, is that as I said, most things that I mentioned before look like sugar, taste like sugar, but it's only the microbes with the right machinery can digest them. And there was a study in 1997 that used a fake gut called the Simulator of the Human Intestinal Microbial Environment, called the SHIME. And it's used in research studies now where they don't want to use animal models, and they can't do human studies for ethical reasons. So they develop a fake gut with its stomach and small intestine and large intestine, etc. They introduced antibiotics into this ecosystem, which caused massive havoc. They introduced candida into it, and within a short period of time, candida was rife through this entire human ecosystem model. Now they introduced lactulose into there, and within 24 hours, 97% of the candida was gone. And that, when I read that, I was, wow, that's very pivotal, and that really changed how I approach the whole candida issue. So yes, targeted prebiotics certainly play a role, and targeted probiotics, those that secrete compounds that have anti-candida action, are useful too. And I think this is the thing about strain specificity, is that not all, just because it's lactobacilli doesn't mean that it's going to produce selective compounds that act selectively to kill off candida. Some do, some don't. So you want to choose a strain that has that unique attribute, relatively unique attribute.
So I'm just going to mention this quickly because someone is saying lactose, and so in the U.S., this prebiotic that he's speaking of, lactulose, is not for like NTAs are not able, our NTPs and NTCs are not able to get that, but we could maybe work with a natural physician or like an osteopath or someone like that who could prescribe it, possibly.
Yeah, it's a bizarre substance that it's bizarre that it's scheduled in the US as a pharmaceutical, because here in Australia, you can just anyway just walk into a pharmacy and buy it, because it's sold as a laxative because the sugar is not absorbed. If you take enough of it, it works as a laxative. Now, in small doses, it works as a prebiotic. And it was even added to infant formula in the 1960s as a way of trying to make it more like breast milk. So it's extremely safe in all different age groups. Yeah, and most natural therapists and naturopaths in Australia would actually be able to sell lactulose. I find it in America's pretty unique market in this way with that particular prebiotic, because you're allowed to sell fast in Indian and galacto-oligosaccharides. So I'm not sure why they selectively made lactulose a pharmaceutical in your land and not elsewhere.
Yeah, I actually read about it in your class, and I think that the reason that it's out there is because whoever regulates that is afraid that it could create diarrhea and cause harm through that. So
magnesium wouldn't do that.
Right.
Oh gosh. Yeah, you have to take a pretty decent, it's certainly beyond the prebiotic dose to achieve the lactate dose for the majority of people.
We're fairly close to Canada up here in Boston, and so we have a vacation planned to Montreal. A lactulose vacation.
I certainly know American practitioners who purchase it either from online pharmacies in Australia or from Canada. So I know that there are people who get around it, whether, I don't know the legalities, so I won't comment on that, but I know people do it, and patients could do it for themselves.
And so, okay, on that note, and this is just to just dip our toes into this subject, would there be anybody who that would be contraindicated for? Like, I know when we studied SIBO, maybe there were some populations of people that they were not able to take lactulose.
Yeah. So lactulose, as I said, has been studied from newborn up through to senior populations, so it is immensely safe as a general rule. But I'd certainly have cautions about using it with some people with SIBO. But you remember from my course, I do use it with some people with SIBO as well. The US is quite well. They tend to use the lactulose breath test. This is going a bit of a tangent, but the lactulose breath test to assess for the presence of SIBO, which is quite different from the rest of the world that often uses glucose as the main food testing substrate. So for me, I always do glucose, fructose, and lactulose because I get a better picture of what's going on, and I can see whether this patient actually has SIBO but doesn't ferment lactulose. In which case, I can use lactulose as a prokinetic, because it has prokinetic activities, as well as it's got its prebiotic qualities too. But if someone had a big spike on lactulose at this 20-minute time mark, then I wouldn't use lactulose in that population. So for somebody with SIBO, lactulose would not be a good fit, and certainly for some people with irritable bowel syndrome, it's not a good fit because it tends to be pretty gas forming too. That said, I've certainly treated people with constipation type IBS with lactulose well, and some people it doesn't work that well, and some people it exacerbates the situation, and it starts getting much more complex, looking at levels of methane-producing bacteria that I think are part of that scenario. So those are probably the two main groups that I would be more cautious about.
I was hoping that you would say the bit about the lactulose versus glucose breath test. So thank you for mentioning that. I think it's a common misconception. I think that's what most practitioners are using right now is lactulose, or they're reading about lactulose on blogs or like that breath test.
I think it really stems back to the developer who patented the lactulose breath test in the States, which is Dr. Pimentel, for that particular purpose, and because I suppose he was the first main driver of the popularity, pushing that new sort of diagnostic label in a different way. So what's the new diagnosis? This is hard to explain, but that it was more common than what we once thought, and that's true enough. But because I think he had patented that test and said this is the test he used, it's really infiltrated the US marketplace, where it really hasn't done to the same degree in other parts of the world. Because if you look at actually the research, it tells you that glucose is a more effective tool to assess for SIBO. But I do think that there are some benefits using lactulose, which is why I would test always 2, but to be honest, I always use 3 fructose, because the number of people I have who flatline on lactulose but have a big spike on fructose or glucose at the 40-minute mark is a lot. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And seldom when I find lactulose pick it up and the other ones not, but it does occasionally happen. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But one of the strengths of lactulose is telling you whether someone's a methane producer. That can be a handy thing as a clinician, where if someone has a long-term constipation issue, you're suspecting that overgrowth of methane-producing bacteria like Methanobrevibacter smithii is a key driver of that long-term constipation, then lactulose, because it doesn't get absorbed and will reach the colon and be fermented, will tell you whether that patient is a methane producer or not. Whereas glucose and fructose, if you don't have methane producing bugs in your small bowel, but you have them in your colon, it won't pick it up.
And immediately. I'm going to ask a few questions more from the people that are viewing. Do you have a little bit more time?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Someone else asked, could you speak about the role of butyrate and the microbiota? Maybe like, would there be specific prebiotics that we could use to feed the microbes that produce butyrate?
Yeah, that's certainly my general approach as a clinician is not, although I do occasionally supplement with pre-made butyrate, but my main approach is to feed the little butyrate making factors in your gut, because that's what we've evolved with. They're there. You feed them, they'll make butyrate for you in large amounts. So my main approach is, because butyrate is a wonderful substance, both as a healing anti-inflammatory substance in the gut, for the colon specifically, but we know it also heals up the small bowel too, but it's inflamed or leaky. But we know it has body-wide, anti-inflammatory effects. It heals up the damaged blood-brain barrier, improves insulin sensitivity. It's a marvelous substance, butyrate. And we do have these little butyrate producing factories in our colon. So there'll be species like Roseburia, Blottia, Anaerostipes, Sodilogranulum, Fecalibacterium, to name sort of 5 of the bigger ones. They're there. And most people, even after very rich diets or chemotherapy, radiotherapy, they might be there in small amounts, but they're often at least surviving. So if we feed them, their populations will grow and they produce more butyrate, and that's the wonderful thing. So that would include things like resistant starch. So you can use things like green banana flour or potato starch. I tend not to. In all honesty, I tend to use food sources of resistant starches, which would be cooked and cooled, root vegetables cooked and cooled, gluten-free grains and cooked and cooled, legumes in general and cooked and cooled. Legumes even higher in resistant starches. And I would use supplementally mostly partially hydrolyzed guar gum, which is one of the substances that would, in my opinion, meets the criteria of a prebiotic, but it targets both bifidobacteria and a number of butyrate-producing microbes in the gut, and you tend to see those populations expand, which is wonderful. And on top of that, it tends to be well tolerated by those people who have, more sensitive tummies to gas production, unlike lactulose and phos, which tend to not be so well tolerated by those populations. And by essentially feeding those species, they produce butyrate. That's the cool thing. And then we get that benefit. But our colon cells, you can see as having a voracious appetite for butyrate. So we only get the systemic or body-wide benefits of butyrate if we produce more than our colon can utilize. So that's the thing to keep in mind there too. So just making sure that you're getting enough food for those species to make sure that populations are healthy, but then to ensure there's enough being produced that it goes into systemic circulation. Yes, thank you for typing that.
Yeah.
It's important that it's partially hydrolyzed. Normal guar gum does not have the same effects. It feeds different bacteria. Partially hydrolyzed, it sounds scary, but it just means it's chopped a little bit. It's not in its full guar gum. It might be molecule this big, and then just chopped into smaller bits. That's the hydrolyzation process. So it's this comes from the guar bean, but it's generally very well tolerated in the vast majority of patients. But it's one of the few prebiotics that actually encourage the growth of butyrate-producing microbes. It's
really affordable also. So I've just been ordering it off iHerb and putting a little scoop in with the Nancy's yogurt and some blueberries, and it's like the gut feast, hopefully.
Totally. And the other thing is it does have a normalizing effect on stool too. So there's research using it in people with diarrhea and research using people with constipation, and it just normalizes it. And I think it does this for most people. So that it's one of those rare substances that you can give to diarrhea type IBS and constipation type IBS, and will help generally both towards. And it's generally well tolerated in patients with SIBO, but importantly, we know from research that it improves the efficacy of antimicrobial treatment in patients with SIBO as well. So it's a oft forgotten adjunct tool in my experience for SIBO patients. Not mine, because I use it in all of them. Right there.
I don't think it's commonly. I think people are afraid to use prebiotics and even probiotics with people that have SIBO. So to know, this can be a tool to help support.
Yeah. I hear you, because I think that was totally out there in the blogosphere, and I think when it comes to something like partially hydrolyzed guar gum, it's completely theoretical concern when we, and particularly, I think they can be okay, except when we have clinical data telling you the complete opposite, that it actually helps improve treatment outcomes. And it's been, there's I think 9 clinical trials using in patients with IBS, showing that it was helpful in their IBS for reducing bloating and distension and improving, stool form and decreasing abdominal pain. And given that many of these same people are saying that most IBS patients have SIBO, it makes sense that it helps this population. It's going to be okay in people with SIBO. And in my experience, because I use it all the time, most tolerate it well. Not all, but most.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so we have a question about probiotic skincare, which is getting more popular. And so this person asks, there's brands out there on the market, and kind of does it work? Specifically, what strains would help treat eczema and which strains might have anti-inflammatory properties?
There's a few that have been used to prevent the development of atopic eczema, and that would be ones like Lactulose rhamnosus GG, Lactulose rhamnosus HN001, I think from memory, but there's fewer that have been shown to treat eczema successfully, and there's Lactulose salivarius, I think it's LC1, don't quote me on the code, I might have that name wrong. It's available in Europe and not in Australia, so I can't use it, so that's why I don't have it so well memorized. It's in the ProbioticAdvisor database. It's there. So that particular strain has been shown to be helpful for treatment of eczema. And there's another strain, the VRI-003 strain of Lactobacillus fermentum, that is available in Australia and North America. That has got some research for treating eczema as well. And I also found clinically that Lactulose rhamnosus GG, that's been hit and miss in the treatment of eczema. Research works. It's hit and miss in practice too. It works in some patients and not in others. So I think they're certainly worth using. And I'd always give prebiotics, particularly inulin floss, in those my eczema patients too. And the combination of that often works well.
Great, excellent. So actually, this is coincidental. I actually first heard about your work from a woman that I worked with in Northern California, and Joey, I think you all went to school together, so she's watching, but she also has a question.
Cool.
When she knew I was starting UWS, she was like, my classmate, you're going to take this class with him. But she's asking, she has a client that has IBS and fibromyalgia, and she says, are there any specific strains for either or both of these that you would recommend?
There certainly is for IBS. There's, to the best of my knowledge, not any research strains for fibromyalgia at this point. I imagine that will change. There are certainly Microbiota studies that suggest that fibromyalgia and, I'm thinking mostly chronic fatigue, but often leads in, are associated with certain microbial imbalances like low levels of butyrate-producing microbes and the levels of Fecalibacterium and Prostate specifically. So I'd often focus in on prebiotics that encourage the populations of butyrate-producing microbes and Fecalibacterium specifically. And that's sorry, but for IBS, we have strains like Lactulose plantarum 299V that is pretty well researched, and Bifidobacterium infantis 3564, which has now been classified as Bifidobacterium longum, subspecies longum 3564 to make that more complicated. Also has some research for the treatment of IBS as well, and there's a few others too. So have the database that lists a summary of the research that's been done on different strains for IBS, because certainly in the research setting, some work and some don't. You can look at the whole field. If you combine all the research and all the probiotics together, the probiotics work for IBS. It's just that some specific ones, it makes sense, don't work. So, and also, if it's someone with constipation type IBS, then Bifidobacterium lactis HN019 is very effective at speeding up gut transit time, and that can decrease bloating and have a huge flow of benefit from that too.
Excellent. Okay, and so the last question that I have here is, what if mom's microflora is not diverse? Do you still get advantages with breast milk?
For sure, because you're still going to get, formula will contain nothing in terms of microbes, or it might, if you're having advanced formula, it might add one or two different strains of bacteria, there's still nothing compared to what's in breast milk. So even if mom's ecosystem is not as fantastic as it was 3 generations ago, it's still going to contain 100 plus different species of bacteria. So it's going to seed and re-inoculate and feed because of the oligosaccharide content of the breast milk in a way that nothing else can. So for sure.
Mm-hmm. And so actually, I just wanted to mention too, because ProbioticAdvisor is your work, and then also Dawn Witten's work, where she focuses more on the microbiota for like preconception and pregnancy and like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So my partner is Dawn. Who's Dawn Witten, who's also a naturopathic physician, but she's a lactation consultant as well. So her passion is breast milk, and her passion and she's loving getting into the glycobiome and microbiome of breast milk. So, and it's amazing stuff when you delve into it, because it's early, relatively early days in the research compared to the gut ecosystem, but we're learning that it's amazingly complex, and it's such an amazing mixture of compounds for the new baby that there's no way that humans will ever be able to replicate the complexity of the unique sugar profile that each mom has that feeds the unique microbiota profile that each mom has. And let alone all the immune factors, etc., that are in there on top of the proteins and starches and vitamins and minerals, etc. It's pretty phenomenal. So it's an area that if you work with soon-to-be moms or new moms, it's worthwhile getting your head around, because it's pretty amazing research, and it's just that field again is just blooming. So every year there's new studies coming out that are changing our view of things.
And so someone asked, how can we take your classes? And so on ProbioticAdvisor, you offer mini courses. Dawn offers courses. So that's a great resource. And just to mention this, Dr. Hawrelak is offering NTPs and NTCs a 50% discount off of, it's the newest course that you have there, Advanced Probiotic Prescribing. So what I can do is put the coupon code for that in this show box so that people can have the information on that.
There's a number of courses, and that sort of expands. So when I find the time where I'm not teaching students here or in UWS, I try to update stuff so I can put it up there to reach, because I love reaching clinicians. Because I think it's like I love seeing patients, and you see that the ripple effect from treating one family can be amazing, but the ripple effect from teaching practitioners is just incredible, because you just see that it's a pretty amazing scenario. So it's a privilege to be in this situation to actually have such the capacity to change people's lives, which is wonderful.
And it's also so cool that you practice. I think that we study with a lot of doctors who are just teaching and lecturing and like that, but it's like to hear your clinical perspective is also really valuable, because you're seeing people in your office. And to be honest, sometimes it's challenging to juggle all the different tasks. I just did 2 14-hour days yesterday, the day before, and that's every week. There's those, and the other days I'm teaching. So, but it's immensely useful, and I think it helps you keep that clinical perspective, and it allows you to test things on people too, because you can read a research study, something may look amazingly promising, and until you actually try it on patients, you don't necessarily know for sure how effective it will be. The research can be convincing, but sometimes what works in the research world doesn't work in the real world, and we can't always work out why that is, but that's certainly the case. Whereas there'll be other situations where you implement something from a new research study I've just read, it works brilliantly, and it revolutionizes my practice, and certainly partially hydrolyzed guar would fit that category. That 2.5 years ago I hadn't heard of it, never used it, and then I came across the research on it, and I started using it, and it's just like, this stuff is brilliant. It's revolutionized how I treat functional constipation type IBS, my methane dominant SIBO patients, and it's just changed outcomes. And you think, okay, that's the privilege of being able to have one foot in each camp. So you're trying to keep up with all the research, to share it with students, and then you get to try these things on your patients, and then you can also feed that back of going, this stuff works brilliant, whereas there might be something else I've tried that it was a complete failure. Didn't work in any patients. It's like I don't share that, and I don't even teach my students about it now. Or if I do, I might say, hey, the research doesn't work, but it doesn't work in my practice anyway. I mean, it's actually a huge conversation happening at NTA right now because we're reworking our curriculum and we're like trying to balance out, you know, like, okay, well, there's all this information that is in the scientific research world, but then there's this gold that is our empirical experience in the office. And so how do we marry that? And really, it seems like the only way is to what you're saying, you know, like you've got to try it out and make sure that it is clinically applicable.
Yeah, and that's a tricky thing because it's hard finding enough lecturing staff that actually have a foot in both camps, essentially. Mm-hmm. You find ones that are often amazingly good clinicians, but that can sometimes mean that they're effective, but not necessarily up in the most recent research. And you can find other people that are up in the recent research, but not clinicians. So they're just sort of lacking some of the real world of how to actually apply this in practice. And I can think of that when I started my first research study I did on patients was back in 2000. And I had patients with IBS, and I gave them massive doses of prebiotic stimulant, and they were bloated and distended and farting like crazy because I just didn't have clinical experience using the substance. You know, I read the studies and hey, this stuff works well, and this is well before FODMAP stuff came out, so I'll clarify that. So what we knew is people with IBS had dysbiosis. People were theorizing that prebiotics would be a useful tool to adjust that dysbiotic picture. So that's what we trialed, but I gave them therapeutic doses all at the outset, and you know, it was an utter failure my first study in terms of patients that got bloated and farting like mad, and very loudly. No less smelly, but very loudly. And because I didn't have the clinical experience to go, okay, you know, and that grew as I started seeing more patients. Then you start with a really low dose, and then you slowly work up to therapeutic dose for weeks to months in some patients. And other patients, you just go, no, I'm not going to use that prebiotic in that case. It might have the right effect on your colonic ecosystem, but you're just not going to tolerate it well. And I can tell that from my experience. Yeah, so it's the testing for the testing field of reality. Yeah, clinical reality. It's good.
I'm curious, is there anything else that you want to share? I mean, I feel like we're just scratching the surface. I'm like, we could stay on here for days and keep going. But if there's anything that is like kind of floating to the top of your mind, we're right at an hour.
Okay. I mean, I think I've covered the things that I love trying to communicate, and that's things about the wonderfulness of prebiotics, ways of nurturing the microbiota, because I think that's the way we have to shift things around. If you know, when people have a dysbiotic picture, it's about nurturing and nourishing, for the most part, to restore populations of microbes. And talk about the strain-specific probiotics. I think really that probiotic paradigm change is that shift is huge. And when you implement that, you'll see such better results because you're not just throwing a multi-strain, high potency at everybody, the same product that may potentially have no research on ensuring that does anything. You're actually targeting things very specifically. Okay, this person has got slow gut transit time, and they're constipated. And if I give them this probiotic, it speeds things up, and they're pooing daily all of a sudden, and another probiotic that doesn't have that action isn't going to do that. So it's just targeting things properly.
Thank you so much for your time and information. And I guess, so I just am going to put this to kind of end the broadcast. This is Dr. Hawrelak's website. And much of the information that he's presenting here is there in blogs, in essays, and then also there's courses offered there, and then the actual ProbioticAdvisor, where you can learn more about strain specificity is on that site. So that's the place to find you.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Same. I'm like, I want to retake your class. So I'll have to go take the courses on the website. So, yeah.
Well, it sort of complements the stuff on UWS for the most part because I've tried to arrange it that way.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Hawrelak, so much.
You're welcome. Nice seeing you in real time too. Take care.
Yeah. Same. Bye-bye.